vamos a comenzar con la conferencia magistral del doctor John Elster. Voy a leer su currículum para que tengamos conocimiento del doctor John Elster. John Elster es doctor por la Universidad de París, ha escrito más de 30 libros y publicado más de 100 artículos en las más prestigiosas revistas de ciencias sociales. Ha trabajado en la Universidad de Chicago, el College de France, la Universidad de Columbia y la Universidad de Oslo. Sus publicaciones incluyen Ulises y las sirenas, Subbreaks, Making Sense of Marx, El cemento de la sociedad, Sentencias salomónicas, Justicia local, Psicología política, Alquimias de la mente, Ulises sin consolidar, cerrando los libros La justicia transnacional en perspectiva histórica, Explaining Social Behavior and Values contra la anarquía, jurados, asambleas y elecciones. Sus intereses de investigación incluyen la teoría de la persona y de la elección colectiva, la filosofía de las ciencias sociales, la teoría de la justicia distributiva y la historia del pensamiento social, Marx y Tocqueville. Hay otro dato que me pareció muy interesante también que me hizo favor de pasarme mi colega del Colegio de México, que lo voy a leer porque me parece que es también muy completo. Es otra parte del currículum para que también la tengan. El doctor es un destacado teórico social que ha publicado trabajos de referencia sobre filosofía de las ciencias sociales y la teoría de la elección racional, miembro del Grupo Septiembre, marxismo analítico, es un crítico de la economía neoclásica y de la teoría de la elección pública, ha desempeñado en las universidades de Oslo, Berkeley, Stanford y Chicago. Actualmente es profesor del Robert K. Merton de Ciencias Sociales en la Universidad de Columbia y profesor titular en el College de France. Entre sus publicaciones destacan las que acabo de leer. Sin más presentaciones, bienvenido John Elster a Toluca. Les deseamos mucha suerte. Gracias.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, because for me that is the most interesting part. So this is the title of the talk, Psychology and Political History, How Constitutions are Made and Why They Tend to be Flawed. So here is the overview. First I'm going to make a little methodological introduction, and then I'm going to argue for 4 propositions. First, constitutions tend to be made in times of crisis. Crises tend to go together with strong passions. Strong passions tend to undermine the rational belief formation. Therefore, constitutions tend to be flawed. I'm going to illustrate that with some case studies and hopefully have time to do what I want to do. And a conclusion. Now, the paper that is the basis for the talk includes much more material than I can present today. The paper can be obtained from Professor Tovar or from me. So, in this proposition, see, I use the expression tend to be made. So it's not a deterministic law-like connection. Some constitutions are made à froid, as they say in French, that is, in a calm and dispassionate manner, often summarized in the saying that constitutions are chains that Peter when sober imposes on Peter when drunk. Now, these cases are actually rare. So, I believe that proposition 4 is true, but it's also in a sense irrelevant, because rational belief formation is not all. Political will and energy are also needed, and these come from passion. So in practice, the choice between a flawed constitution and no constitution, not between a flawed constitution and an ideal one. And in the diagram, you can see the causal chains that I'm going to discuss. The talk is programmatic. I want to argue for the relevance of psychology for the study of political history, using constitution making as an example. And by psychology, I mean something like the following: an approach to human behavior that does not assume that people have rational beliefs and stable preferences. In other words, implicitly, the talk is also a polemic against the so-called rational choice history. And should explain explain my sources. I have got two theoretical sources. The first is the French moralists of the 17th century, which I'll cite several times, and the other is behavioral economics, a recent branch of experimental psychology. From the French moralists, I take the overall distinction among interest, reason, and passion, or emotion, as motivation for behavior. And from behavioral economics, I take a number of findings, and let me just list some of them. Emotions can shape time preferences, they can shape risk preferences, they can induce low-quality beliefs by suboptimal gathering of information, they can induce biased beliefs by wishful and counter-wishful thinking, and they can induce a hot-cold empathy gap. I'll explain these things later. And finally, emotions typically have a short half-life. I'm going to begin by reading from an editorial in the Financial Times, August 16, 2014. France's national crisis expresses itself in multiple ways. It is about poor economic growth, rising public debt, and higher unemployment. It is about the smoldering anger of France's ex-colonial minorities. It is about discredited political parties, the left trapped in anti-capitalist platitudes that its reformist wing is unable to squash. The right overwhelmed by scandals and factional disputes. More and more, however, France's crisis is about the presidential system of government and the Fifth Republic itself. The notion of a Sixth Republic, less presidential nature, was a theme in the 2007 campaign of Ségolène Royal, the socialist candidate. She lost, but the idea remains alive. True, fundamental constitutional change tends not to occur smoothly in France. Each of the earlier four French republics expired in 1804, 1851, 1940, and 1958 in a coup or a war. But abuses under the Fifth Republic's presidential system are growing. Politicians must waste no more time before giving new life to French democracy. So this illustrates proposition 1. Constitution tends to be made in times of crisis. But I'll elaborate a little bit on this by restating the perspective from the perspective of the birth rather than demise of republics. So this is a pretty complete list of French constitutions. The First Republic was created in August 1793 in the context of war and massacres. The second in 1848 as a result of revolution. The third in 1871 after the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War. The fourth in 1946 after the defeat of the Vichy regime. The fifth in 1958 and the threats on generals in Nigeria. These are the republics. But the French historical record also includes other regimes and constitutions made in times of crisis. The Constitution of 1791 was the outcome of violence in Paris and the countryside. That of 1795 marked the end of the terror. The Constitutions of 1799, 1802, and 1804 represented successive stages in Napoleon's ascent to absolute power. The Charters of 1814 and 1815 marked the restoration of the monarchy. The Charter of 1830 came about through the revolution, and the Constitution of 1852 came about by a coup d'etat. So you see there's a constant, invariant correlation between crisis and constitution making, in France at least. Now, compared to these epochal moments, today's French crisis doesn't seem very deep, but things could of course get worse. So, more generally, when I look at the constitutional history, I find 8 types of crises that can trigger constitution making. Fear of breakup of the country, financial crisis, violent social unrest, revolution, regime implosion, fall of a dictatorship, end of a war, and fear of a coup. In the paper, I illustrate all of these cases with historical examples. Today, I'm just going to mention, just to give you a feeling for the process, give you one example how financial crisis can trigger constitution making. The calling of the Estates General in France in themselves into a constituent National Assembly was triggered by an acute fear that the country might become insolvent and unable to pay interest on its bonds. The calling of the Federal Convention in America in 1787 also owed a great deal to the monetary chaos of the country, with the individual states issuing every deprecating, depreciating paper money and bonds. And finally, the recent constitution-making episodes in Hungary and in Iceland occurred in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008. I'm going to give you, well, let me improvise a little bit here. Think of a 2x2 table. That is what you do for your bread and butter, right? On one dimension, you have passion and no passion. And the other dimension, you have constitution making or no constitution making. So I claim that the self in this 2x2 table, defined by passion and constitution making, has a number of examples. I'm now going to show the opposite case, lack of passion and lack of constitution making. And that is a negative case of Canada, where the status of Quebec has been a consistently destabilizing issue in its life. And on two occasions, elite negotiations revolving around this question reached agreements on a new constitution that neither passed the hurdles of ratification. Now, the historian of these processes, Peter Russell, wrote that it was clear that the present generation of Canadians will not try again to reach an accord on a broad package of constitutional changes designed to prevent an immunity crisis. If in the near future, Canada plunges once again into the constitutional maelstrom, it will be because there is an actual, not an apprehended, crisis of national unity. So, no passion, no constitution making. Now I'm going to show you an exception to my generalization. So this will be the cell in the table where you have constitution making but no passion. Sweden 1974. So the abolition of the bicameral system and reform of the constitution has been called institutional change rather than constitutional change because of the routine manner in which it was carried out. I think I'll skip the rest of the slide because I have to keep in mind the scarcity of time, the scarce resources. Now, think again of the 2x2 table. So far I have illustrated passion and constitution making, absence of passion and absence of constitution making, absence of passion and constitution making, that is the then the fourth case will obviously be passion and absence of constitution making. And I think Iceland 2011 illustrates that. As I'll indicate later, the Icelandic constitution-making process was triggered by strong anger against those responsible for the financial crisis. But so far, the process has not led to the adoption of an actual constitution, because Parliament, which would use then its powers in the new constitution, has refused to ratify. So, let me mention some constitutional emotions. Emotion theorists often find, classify, identify some 2 or 3 dozen emotions. But I think the most relevant emotions in the constitution-making process are fear, enthusiasm, anger, and frightfulness or self-love. And that might sound strange, but I'll give an example towards the top if I have time. Concerning fear, the fundamental issue, which is very difficult often in practice, is to distinguish between what you might call prudential fear and visceral fear. Prudential fear is just rational choice, as it were. If I see out of the window that it's raining and I don't want to get wet, I take an umbrella. So I fear that it will rain. Maybe I fear because I've heard it on the radio. I fear it will rain. I take my umbrella. That is just an ordinary rational choice with no emotion involved. Then there's visceral fear, the kind of thing that keeps you awake at night or makes you panic. And sometimes it's hard to distinguish whether agents are motivated by prudential fear or by visceral fear. Let me mention here as an aside that the famous dictum by Franklin Roosevelt, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, should be understood, in my opinion. The only thing we have prudential reasons to fear is visceral fear. Now, I'm going to document in a short while the importance of enthusiasm in constitution making. Now, it so happens that emotion theorists have not recognized enthusiasm for an emotion. I've read many handbooks, textbooks, survey articles, and so on about emotions. Not a single one mentions enthusiasm on a par with other emotions. But I think it's clear that there is such a thing as enthusiasm. I'm going to define it as you see here. Enthusiasm is triggered by the belief that a public interest or a moral good can be realized by collective action in the face of organized opposition. And enthusiasm in practice can be recognized by its behavioral effects: supernormal energy, subnormal impulse density, and, crucially, lower risk aversion and even risk seeking. And as I understand it, this emotion is morally neutral. It can motivate Nazis, Islamists, or fanatics, or Democrats. So now I'm going to give you a couple of examples from French constitutional history of how constitution makers were simultaneously subject to fear and enthusiasm. In the spring and summer of 1789, something erupted in the French countryside called the Great Fear, which towards the end of July 1789 led to attacks on castles, burning of property records, and in some cases killing of nobles. So when news of this reached the Constituent Assembly in Versailles in early August 1789, the constitution makers panicked. The first reaction was to suppress these activities, but then after 24 hours delay, they switched completely and opted for concessions. So, in the night of August 4, 1789, feudalism was literally abolished overnight in France. That is, feudal burdens and privileges were more or less unanimously, although not always sincerely, agreed upon. Now, then a funny thing happened. First, the deputies stood up in vigil and renounced their own privileges. But then a wave of collective enthusiasm swept the assembly. So they went beyond what they were motivated to do by their fear and abolished a number of privileges that were completely unrelated to the peasant rebellions. So, as Tocqueville says, towards the bottom of the slide here, the decrees were the combined result in doses very positively determined of fear and enthusiasm. So there's no question that on that occasion, emotions played a major role in massive constitutional change. Now I'm going to move to 1848, still in France. The French Revolution of 1848 took place in February with street violence. There was then election to a Constituent Assembly, of which Tocqueville himself was a member. He was also a member of the Constitutional Committee of that parliament. There were several violent episodes during the sitting of the Constituent Assembly. On May 15th, the workers of Paris invaded the Assembly. In June, the workers of Paris rose in insurrection when the Assembly abolished the national workshops that it had created to pacify the workers. And you can see how these violent events shaped the first and the second draft of the Constitution. But I just want to read another quote from Tocqueville. Ignore the top, the first paragraph, just look at the second. The nation had a sort of frenzied desire to see the work of constitution making finished and to see authority established. The Assembly shared this longing and was constantly goading us, though there was hardly any need to do so. For members of 15th of May, that was when the workers invaded the Assembly, and apprehensions of the days of June, that is the insurrection of workers, combined with the sight of a divided, weak and incapable government in charge of affairs, were enough to drive us on. But the thing that most effectively drive the committee of the freedom of mind was fear of outside events and enthusiasm of the moment. It's difficult to appreciate how much expression of revolutionary ideas affected even those minds least subject to such influence, and how it almost was conscious of growth of power when the next growth, and sometimes even in a different direction. So, now I'm going to give you one more example. Anger in Iceland. So, anger seems to have been the most important motivation behind the Icelandic constitution process. Was triggered by financial crisis, not only by the general crisis that hit all Western economies, but also by local and serious mismanagement. A leading reformer wrote, when countries crash, the natural thing for their inhabitants to do, inter alia, is inspect the legal and constitutional foundations to look for latent flaws and to fix them. This was in fact one of the demands of the Pots-and-Pan revolution that shook Iceland after the country's spectacular financial crash in October 2008. In the words of another observer, public outrage, anger, was after the economic collapse of the government converged on the issue of writing a new constitution. So what I can do so far is illustrating proposition 2. Strong crisis can go together with strong passions. First, remember by some examples I illustrated proposition 1. Now through the three emotions of fear, enthusiasm, and anger, I have illustrated proposition 2. So now I'm going to move on to arguing that passion can lead to irrational belief formation. So I'm going to discuss both how passion can shape ends and how it can shape beliefs about needs. So first, passion and ends. So the ancient and modern moralists tend to oppose passion to reason. It's hard to know what they meant by reason, so I'm going to stipulate a definition which I think covers more or less their intention. Reason requires the choice of rational needs, that's the first part, to promote the long term, the second part, public interest and freedom. So that we captured the second and third component when you wrote that to think only of oneself and on the present time is a source of error in politics. So, in other words, reason is the choice of rational needs to implement the long-term public interest. Now, the moralists did not really explicitly require the choice of rational needs, but assumed they had, I think they assumed that would be part of reason too. So, rational choice or rational good information requires first optimal gathering of information, and rational, that is unbiased, cognitive processing of this information. Okay, so let's move on to how passion may shape beliefs about the ends. Kant, writing about enthusiasm, said the following. Enthusiasm, like any other emotion, is blind either in the choice of its end, or if this is given by reason, in its implementation. But it is that movement of the mind that makes it incapable of engaging in free consideration of principle. So I understand him as saying that enthusiasm is an obstacle to the rational choice of means to implement the very end that it inspires. So the emotion trips itself up, as it were. And a Kant scholar summarizes this by saying that the best in enthusiasm, the best becomes the enemy of the good. So far, I have just got to the classics, the moralists, and up to Kant. Now I want to move on to behavioral economics. Remember my other source of thinking about these issues. How emotions distort cognitions. So, the first one is urgency. When you are in the grips of a strong emotion, you want to act immediately. And sometimes that is good, because there might be an acute danger. But sometimes you want to act immediately, even when there is no acute danger. And then that urgency leads to suboptimal investment in information gathering. So that leads to what you might call a low quality belief based on insufficient information. Second, emotions can induce motivated belief formation or biased belief formation. And I'd like to summarize this in a saying from La Fontaine: each believes easily what he fears and what he hopes. And this has two sub-varieties. The first, which we all know, is wishful thinking, which leads to excessive optimism, whereas Adam Greenspan famously said about financial markets, irrational exuberance. But there's another variety here that La Fontaine captures, namely counter-wishful thinking, acting against one's desires and against the evidence, leading to excessive pessimism, as in panic rumors. And further, my friend and colleague George Loewenstein has identified a mechanism that he refers to as the hot-cold empathy gap. When you are in the grip of a passion, you cannot really imagine that it will not persist forever. Although it will not, because of the short half-life of emotions. Now, there are two interesting topics that are mentioned but skipped. Emotions may affect risk preferences as well as risk assessments. And emotions may use a higher rate of time discounting as well as a truncated cognitive horizon. These are important mechanisms, but I discuss them in a paper, but I do not have the time to discuss them here. So I'm now going to give you some examples to show how these strong emotions on self-constitution, in self-constitution-making episodes led to irrational belief formation that led to flawed constitutions. And I begin with the Federal Convention in 1787. I believe that among American constitutional theorists tend to underestimate the importance of social unrest and social violence in the making of the American Constitution. There was widespread revolt in many states against excessive taxation. Taxation was seen as deeply unjust because the taxes were used to repay speculators who had bought up war bonds at bargain basement prices to repay them in full, at full value, in gold and silver. So this created severe social unrest in many American states, culminating in Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts, 1786, 1787, where a band of 2,000 men almost managed to capture the federal armory, that is, in Springfield. If that happened, if that succeeded in that, then there might have been a genuine violent revolution in Massachusetts, but they failed at the last moment. But I think threw a panic into the East Coast elite of the United States. And the panic first induced them to call a federal convention, a constitutional convention, to write a new constitution. And second, shaped very strongly the constitutional document itself, notably by allowing the new centralized government to crush down rebellions like the Shays' Rebellion. And Thomas Jefferson, who was in Paris at the time as American ambassador to Paris, but followed the events in Philadelphia quite closely, wrote to a friend, "Our convention has been too much impressed by the insurrection of Massachusetts, and in the spur of the moment, we are setting up a kite, a hawk, to keep the hen yard in order. I hope in God this article will be rectified before the new constitution is accepted." In other words, Jefferson thought that the framers panicked, and I think he was right. Now, it's important to realize that the state of affairs in 1787 was pretty bad, because the existing constitutional document, the Articles of Confederation, made it almost impossible to act efficiently on a national scale. And certainly, the constitution that the Federal Convention proposed was superior to what it replaced, but it was nevertheless flawed, because what the framers saw as the effects of excessive democracy in the states was in reality effects of excessive taxation in the states. So you can say that the framers overreacted in panic against the flaws of the Articles of Confederation and of the state constitutions, because they misperceived the nature of the problem. Now, the second example would be France in 1789. And there one can find many, many examples of how the emotions, enthusiasm and fear, and also directly shaped the procedures. I already mentioned the decisions on the night of August 4, 1789. A couple of days later, many framers regretted what they had done, because their emotions subsided. As I said, emotions have a short half-life. But since news about the decrees had been spread throughout France, it was impossible to go back on the decisions. It's very clear that for many framers, these emotions were made in a moment of enthusiasm that they later regretted. You can also see, if you look at the detailed behavior of the deputies, how many of them were motivated directly by fear of their for their lives. In the paper I gave extensive citations from the correspondence. So one of them, the Comte de Ferrières, his wife, telling her what to do to avoid being the object of attack. And he also explains that his voting in the assembly was dictated by fear. And take another example, on August 4, 1789, the tithe was abolished, that is, the 10% of the peasant's income that went to the church. Initially, the clergy in the assembly opposed this measure. After a couple of days, they changed their mind, apparently because they were physically threatened. Another example has to do with the adoption of two very important constitutional clauses in September 1789. One, creating a unicameral legislature rather than a bicameral one, and the other creating a suspensive veto for the king rather than an absolute veto for the king. And with respect to both these votes, we find letters by deputies saying that they were afraid for their lives and those of their families. There's throats chicken will be cut if I vote the wrong way. Now, this was probably not true, but that's already relevant, because fear and panics can have causal efficacy even when they are unfounded. The final example is quite interesting, I think, because it shows rather specifically how the findings of behavioral economics can be used to understand the impact of emotions on decisions. This has to do with procedure. As you may know, it's common in many parliaments to require that any proposal shall be discussed on several separate occasions to prevent impulsive, hasty, and perhaps bad decisions. The French parliaments were very familiar with the British system, with the British Parliament, where several readings are required. And on July 28, 1789, they wrote this into their internal rules of order. But then came the night of August 4th, and they forgot all about the rules. So let me give you some quotes here. Article 4.4 of the rules says that no proposal can be discussed on the day of the session in which it has been proposed, except if the matter is urgent and the Assembly decides that the proposal should be discussed immediately. Now, this is a very weak form of self-binding. This example means nothing. But, in addition, it says that any proposals in legislative or constitutional matters must be brought to discussion on 3 different days. But almost from the beginning, and certainly on August 4th, that is the day it abolished feudalism, the Assembly ignored its own rules. So one deputy complained that in order to engage the Assembly to consent to all the decrees of August 4th, one had to destroy the wisest rule of the Assembly itself, which put a break on hasty deliberations. Having tried to stem the tide on August 4th, another deputy also referred to the violation of the rules in a speech on August 6th. In response, those who wanted immediate action said that an élan of patriotism does not need 3 days. And since one cannot vary such sentiments, the 3 days would be a pointless waste of time. So the first statement, and then élan of patriotism does not need 3 days, reflects the urgency of the emotion. And the second statement, one cannot vary in such sentiments, reflects the hot-cold empathy gap. That is, in the grip of their emotion, the deputies could not believe that it would not subsist forever. Well, I'm Norwegian. This is the 200th centennial for the Norwegian Constitution. And I just made my paper on that Constitution. And it shows, I think, illustrates many of the things I've been mentioning in this talk, but I do not have the time to go into detail. What I just want to mention is that Norwegian framers in 1814 were in a constant state of enthusiasm. As one historian writes, enthusiasm was a normal state of mind. So this led them to wishful thinking, notably with respect to the possibility of Norway becoming a totally independent country. But we come by some kind of accidental miracle, which I cannot explain to you today. This wishful thinking constitution was given them a better constitution than the one they would have obtained if they had been cool and rational and realized the constraints of the international scene. So in this case, enthusiasm led to a very happy outcome. There is a famous decree by the French Assembly in 1791, which shows that enthusiasm can be disastrous. Robespierre proposed that the framers, the constitution makers, should declare themselves ineligible to the first ordinary legislature, so that nobody could suspect them of writing a constitution for themselves. Actually, that wasn't Robespierre's intention. He wanted to create a legislature full of inexperienced men, which would permit the Jacobin clubs to take power. And that is what happened. So the Jacobins took power and we got the terror. So the enthusiasm of the framers on May 16, 1791 really was the cause, the here and enthusiasm. Now I want to focus on another aspect of this process, which is hard to convey in a few minutes. The framers of 1848 behaved irrationally, clearly, when they created, in the Constitution, direct popular election of the president. Because they knew, or should have known, that this would lead to the election of the nephew of Napoleon I, Louis Bonaparte Napoleon, a notorious political adventurer, someone whom they did not want to be elected. So they should have known, because it was clear that Louis Napoleon was quite popular, they should have known that by direct election of the president, he was the choice. But the leader of parliament, the leader of the executive, General Cavaignac, persuaded himself that he would be chosen in popular election. He could have imposed indirect elections on the president by parliament. He would have been sure to win, but he wanted to be elected directly. So he imposed direct elections and lost completely. He lost 20% of the vote, and Louis Napoleon got 74% of the vote. This was a case of sheer wishful thinking by a constitution maker that he was in a position to be elected by direct elections, where, as any sober reflection of the situation, for instance, as Tocqueville did. Tocqueville knew that Louis Napoleon would be elected, but he didn't manage to impose his views on the assembly. Well, I had some other nice quotes from this. I'll skip that. So now I'll go to the conclusion. So earlier I mentioned famous view of constitution making, to which I have unfortunately contributed. It's famous, but it's completely wrong. The constitutions are changed that Peter when sober imposes on Peter when drunk. So if that metaphor expressed how things really are, you should not expect a constitution to be typically flawed. At least if sober is taken in the sense of motivated by reasons. However, if the term is taken in the sense of dispassionate, Peter when sober might be motivated partly or only by his interest. And some constitution-making processes and documents they produced have no doubt been flawed because shaped by the very sober interests of the public. So the importance of slavery-related issues, like the Geneva Convention, provides a starting example. But this source of constitutional flaws is not my concern here. I try to turn the metaphor on its head to consider the flaws of constitutions that Peter when drunk imposes on a later Peter, whether drunk or sober. As the Swedish counterexample shows, and there are no others, one cannot make a conceptual claim that framers tend to be under the influence of passion, but I have tried to make some empirical arguments. Here they are. First, I made a factual claim that constitutions tend to be made in circumstances that induce strong emotions. Although the geographical sphere of my selected case is limited, within that sphere, at least, the claim seems to hold up well. Second, I made a causal claim that because vested interests are so important in politics as usual, more than interest is required to bring about a transition to constitutional higher politics. Reason by itself may provide what is needed, as was perhaps the case in Sweden in 1974, but passion is usually more effective, especially in an alliance with reason. And finally, this is really the core argument, I made a causal claim about factual or causal beliefs. Constitutional emotions cause framers to form beliefs about matters of fact or means and relations that subvert the ends that the very same emotions generate. So if constitution making usually requires passion, it follows that most constitutions will have a cognitive basis. But as I said, if you compare the Articles of Confederation with the document produced by the Federal Convention, a flawed constitution may nevertheless be superior to the system that it replaces. So the comparison of a hypothetical constitution created by people going sober is relevant, and these constitutional features are never going to be sober. Thank you.
Bueno, vamos a las gracias al doctor John Elster. Thank you very much for your conference, doctor. It's a pleasure to have with us. Ahora vamos a continuar con la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Para eso va a estar al frente mi colega del Colegio de México, el doctor Billy Balson Leiner, para esta parte de preguntas y respuestas. Billy Balson, por favor.
Yes, I want to thank, in the name of all of us, John Elster for the conference, and what I suggest is we do have 30 minutes for the debate, and then we're going to go directly to the second conference. We're just going to change. So we do have 30 minutes for a debate. What I would ask you is to formulate your questions as clear as possible. So, and then if there is a question that Professor Elster wants to take immediately, we take it immediately, and otherwise we take 2, 3, 4 questions to provide collective input. So please feel free.
Muchas gracias, doctor, por su conferencia. Creo que en efecto todos tenemos que recordar el papel de las emociones en la política. Yo le quiero pedir su opinión sobre el tema de la razón. Usted citó a Kant. Kant distingue dos tipos de razón práctica. La razón práctica pura, que se traduce en el imperativo categórico, y la razón práctica empírica, que se traduce en el imperativo hipotético, normalmente identificado con la racionalidad en sentido de la teoría económica. ¿Qué papel considera usted que tiene, si es que usted considera que tiene algún papel, la razón pura práctica, en el sentido kantiano, en la formulación de las constituciones? Y la segunda pregunta, muy ligada a esta, su opinión sobre la propuesta de John Rawls de razón pública como aquella que va más allá de la racionalidad en sentido instrumental o en sentido de la economía neoclásica, y trata de encontrar ese tipo de objetivos que solo la razón pura práctica en sentido kantiano puede proponer. Su opinión, si fuera tan amable, sobre ambas cosas.
I'd like to ask why it's fresh in my mind. Thank you. In fact, Kant's conceptual reason was entirely different from mine. Kant's conceptual reason was non-consequentialist, as you know, deontological. I define reason as concerned with the long-term public interest, that is a purely consequentialist conceptual reason. So I did not, when I cited Kant, I did not implicitly adopt his conceptual reason. I cited Kant to show how he understood that an emotional enthusiasm can subvert the choice of ends in public affairs. So I'm concerning the difference between reason and rationality. I actually published a book with that title, Reason and Rationality, and I think they are very different because reason has to do both with the good choice of ends and the rational choice of means, whereas rationality is completely different with regard to the choice of ends and focuses only on the choice of means to realize whatever ends the agent happens to have, even horrible ends, like genocides.
Sí, muchas gracias. Si pensamos que las constituciones... si pensamos que las constituciones, según su planteamiento, están hechas por la pasión o la crisis del momento, el enderezamiento, es decir, las reformas que se hacen después, nos aseguran que no van a ser fallidas, porque no es una cuestión de apasionamiento. Si realmente hay una deliberación en los legisladores que garanticen que sin pasión van a tener una mejor constitución. Muchas gracias.
I'm going to translate the question. I mean, can we be sure that the Constitution is going to be, that the Constitution is not going to be flawed if there is no passion involved, and it is.
Okay, what I said was that there's not going to be a constitution if there's no passion. So the question is not, so as I said at the beginning, the choice is not between a flawed constitution and a good constitution. The choice is between a flawed constitution and no constitution. So I think that answers the question.
Thank you, Professor. We appreciate very much your attendance here to your conference. And my question is very direct. I would like to, and it's intended to know your opinion about if you ever have studied or history, the Latin American history, about the making of constitution in Latin America. What kind of devices are contained with the Latin American experience, if you have ever compared it with this kind of examples that we have now over and over discussed about the remaking of the constitution in our countries. For instance, the nationalists and many other leadership, the kind of leadership that we have, and we cannot do a good achievement with having a correct making of laws, for instance, in our countries. And I would like to know if you have ever studied this kind of situation in particular. Thank you very much in advance for the
Unfortunately, to my regret today, and to the detriment of my scholarship, I never took the time to learn Spanish or Portuguese for that matter. If I'd done so, I think my work would have been much better and illuminated by a much larger variety of cases. So I read about Latin American constitution making in secondary sources in English or French, but that doesn't really help, because in constitution making, as everywhere, the devil is in the detail. Indeed, for the detail, you need to go to original sources. Now, my student at Columbia, now professor at CIDE, Gabriel Negreto, wrote under my supervision a dissertation on the making of the Argentinian Constitution 1853, which I believe is still in force. So I learned a lot about that particular episode from him, but I'm afraid I cannot recollect it clearly enough right now to see how what my talk today, how it could be relevant for that process. But I would suspect that both propositions 1 and propositions 2 would be verified in Latin American context. That's what I would suspect, without knowing much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah. I had also a related question to your talk to the constitutionalism or the constitutional reforms in Latin America. I'm not sure that crises are very much connected to the right. I'm not sure whether crises are directly connected to the writing of new constitutions in Latin America, but strong passions and emotions there are. So maybe we should differentiate the kind of emotions that drive constitutional writing I was wondering, because we have in the last 20 years a lot of constitutional writing and new constitutions and amendments. I was wondering if your theory is explaining how you adopt a new constitution. If your theory also could explain this kind of constitutional instability that we have in the region. So adoption and instability.
Yes, that's an interesting question, whether if Proposition 3 is true, if constitutions are built on irrational beliefs, that might undermine their stability. If the constitution makers engage in wishful thinking about what will work, and when they meet reality and it doesn't work, that might create constitutional instability. Certainly the United States is a counterexample to that. The American Constitution of 1787, still in force, I think it was flawed because it created too many checks on the popular will, if you will, the Senate and the presidential veto, and implicitly also judicial review. I think it's flawed, and I think the flaws are visible and tangible in American politics today, but it certainly does not create any instability. And the Norwegian Constitution, which is the second oldest in the world, was also made in a moment of enthusiasm. But I don't think the enthusiasm actually affects the specific clauses of the Constitution. But I think from French history, you can probably find cases. I think the Constitution of 1848 is one of them, in which the Constitution was made in such a large proportion of irrationality that it could not last, and it didn't, because it was a coup d'etat by Napoleon Bonaparte, December 2nd, 1851, and then he turned himself into Napoleon III. So I think that's a good question. And I agree with you that if my proposition 3 is true, then you would expect that some constitution will be undermined by the irrationality in the formulation of specific clauses in the Constitution.
Buenos días, gracias por su presentación y sobre todo por esta articulación. Buen día, gracias por introducirnos en este concepto de emociones, porque me lleva a pensar también en esta dimensión de Max Weber cuando nos habla de las causas de la acción social en la cual el individuo está orillado a actuar. Y también me preguntaba yo si esto tiene que ver con estas tuercas y tornillos que mueven a la sociedad y si van detonando justamente todas estas acciones que últimamente hemos estado viendo a nivel Latinoamérica en el sentido de los movimientos sociales y cómo los gobiernos, por ejemplo, de Evo Morales o cómo los gobiernos de Ecuador nos han cambiado como instituciones y han logrado trascender, han cambiado esta visión de democracia justamente por esta socialización de la emoción de cambiar y transitar hacia la democracia. ¿Qué me dice al respecto?
I did not in my talk discuss the constitutional amendments. I only focused on the wholesale making of a new constitution from scratch. It is clear that constitutional amendments can also generate strong emotions, notably when a president tries to change the constitution to make himself or herself re-eligible a second time or a third time. And I know from Colombia, which is the Latin American country I know best, that the process created very strong emotions. You see, I don't think my framework can be immediately applied to constitutional amendments because in the case of an amendment, there's also always a choice of doing nothing. But in different countries in a crisis, that option may not be available. So that's why I don't think, so for instance, in France in 1789, doing nothing was not an option.
idea interesting. There's something about it I don't quite understand. And it's this. Is it possible to tell that the Constitution is a good Constitution before one has seen what consequences it proves and has? If so, how is it possible to tell that it's a good Constitution? In particular, is the idea of a good Constitution dependent on the existence of a clear common interest for a given population, currently politically organized in a particular state?
Closer to the mouth. Okay. Hannibal said ahead of time what a good constitution would be. That is, if belief formation was rational. Well, here on this point, I really believe that the only thing we can do is to opt for what John Rawls would have called imperfect procedural justice. That is, no, we cannot tell what a good constitution will be because that depends so much on unforeseeable circumstances, world wars, economic crisis, rebellions, whatever. So the only thing one can do is to purify the constitution-making process as much as possible from at least insulated from interest. But so the paradox, John, is that Condorcet, who wrote, tried to write draft for a French constitution, he was probably not very strongly shaped by passion, but his draft had no influence. So maybe one can, in the abstract, say something about what a good constitution would be. But that constitution might not be able to mobilize the energy that would be necessary for it to be adopted. That wasn't very well put either, but I'll stop there.
Dr. Esther, my name is Isaac Riquelme. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your very interesting conference. I'm really impressed with your very deep knowledge and thinking. My question is, in which way write a new constitution or make reforms after a political or an economical crisis could affect or could change the society's behavior, and how it could be reflect in the vision and the concept that they have about their government? Thank you once again.
So the question is how new constitutions can not only create new institutions, but change what you might call political culture. Is that it? Well, distinguish between two things. Can you predict such changes? And will they occur? To the second question, certainly yes. To the first question, no. I don't think one can deliberately and intentionally create a constitution, deliberately, intentionally, and successfully create a constitution to change political culture. Nobody knows how culture is shaped, how political preferences, customs, norms, and so on are changed. So constitutions do affect political culture in unpredictable and mysterious ways. Sorry about that.
Morning, my name is Isis Juarez from Opaez. Well, my question is the next. Our constitution was created at the end of a revolution full of murder and crisis, occupation. Next 2017, we are going to celebrate 100 years of our constitution. However, some politicians and lawyers think that we need a new constitution because we have an old constitution with a lot of reforms and almost 50,015. So what do you think about it?
Well, it follows what I said, right? You need a crisis. No, I don't think I can say more than that. You need a crisis. I don't wish a crisis upon Mexico. proposals, probably lots of draft constitutions lying around in law schools, but bigger crisis.
While we get a couple of more questions, I will maybe add one. I mean, when we study constitutional law, we tend to believe that there is a very strong cultural input in the framing and the shaping of constitutions. And we tend to believe that the constitutions reflect cultural agreements widely shared by nations and so on. My question is, your model is a universal proposal to analyze constitutions, but are there regional, cultural specificities? Does it make sense to speak of Latin America as a region when we look at it from the constitutional framing point of view?
Well, this theory, summarizing these four propositions, is intended to be universal, not deterministic, because there are exceptions, but they're not limited. Now, of course, the adaptation of this theory, of these propositions, to particular regions must take account of such regional specificities. The constitutions are studied most closely for several years while they were being made, were the East European constitutions following the collapse of communism in 1989. And it is clear that the past, the context, the communist past of those countries shaped constitution making deeply. Sometimes negatively, that is, you got reactive constitution making, that's for all, let's avoid errors of the past, and sometimes more subtly, through continuity. So, for instance, in Eastern Europe, the importance of positive rights was a legacy from the communist era, because in communism, the only thing people had was security. So that what people were create security in the constitution and wrote very strong social rights into the constitutions. So I imagine that in Latin America too, the actual dynamic of the constitution making process and the clauses that are included or excluded will depend very much on such factors. For instance, the role of the military, I assume, must be very important in constitution making on this continent. I know it has been so in the past, but these are just generalities. I cannot be more specific.
Okay, then just one last question. No, there is another question. Oh.
Buenos días, doctor. Mi nombre es María Cruz Rodríguez. Mi pregunta va respecto a cómo considera usted estas reformas constitucionales que ha habido en México últimamente, en el año 2013 y 2014, y si considera que son una forma de entusiasmo o enojo por parte de la sociedad mexicana, así como la empatía que tienen los legisladores, o que tuvieron más bien, así como el presidente de la República, para producir tales reformas estructurales. Muchas gracias por su conferencia.
If I understood the question correctly, you're referring to recent constitutional reforms in Mexico that would not have been passed except in the way of enthusiasm. Well, the role of enthusiasm is essentially to break down petty, local, short-term partisan interest. In a moment of enthusiasm, actors are willing to ignore their interests. So not knowing anything about the processes you are talking about, I cannot tell whether that was the case here. But the reason why enthusiasm may be necessary to repeat is that Well, let me cite from one of my heroes in the French Constitution. Here. In 1799, the Comte Clermont said, "Anarchy is a frightening yet necessary passage, and the only moment one can establish a new order of things. It is not in calm times that we can take uniform measures." So that's an early statement of my theory. And maybe that was the case in Mexico in these amendments, but to repeat, I don't know.
Maybe just one last question, if you would want to answer to it. There was a debate on the American Constitution, which is the oldest written constitution that is still in place, about how democratic is the US Constitution, because it was not necessarily framed in democratic times, and I don't know if you would like to have a position on that.
Yes, it's an interesting question. Well, the founders, the framers, the Articulated Convention, would have liked it to be much less democratic than it is. However, they decided early on that for ratification of the Constitution, they would bypass the state legislatures, which were used by many of their powers, and call for directly elected ratified conventions. Now, because practice of suffrage and the extent of democracy varied a great deal in the several states, the framers pulled their punches, as it were. They made the document more democratic than they wanted to, ideally, in order to increase its chances of being ratified by a sufficient number of states. So you could say that although the American Constitution in some ways is deeply, or I think it's a counter-revolutionary document, but it is also, of course, in many ways democratic. But it's democratic to some extent by accident, or because the framers had to respect had to constantly think about, will this proposal be ratified? And several times at the Federal Convention, you hear people like Madison and others saying that, well, I would like to impose restrictions on suffrage in the Constitution, but that might, then the document might not be ratified.
Thank you very much, Professor Elster. So I would like to thank Professor Elster for the conference, and I would also like to thank our hosts, Dr. Edgar Ulises Portillo of the Universidad Autónoma del Estado de México, who is going to close the conference. And we're going to stay to be seated until we just change afterwards, so we can start on time the next conference with John Dunn. And I go back to Edgar Ulises Portillo.
Bueno, antes que nada, también quiero agradecer la presencia aquí de mi colega del Colegio de México, el doctor Billy Batson Leiten. Ahora vamos a proceder a la entrega del reconocimiento para el doctor John Elster. Doctor, we are going to proceed now to give you the honors of this. And I'm going to say also that in Spanish for all the people, but in personal, I want to say thank you for coming here to Toluca, to our university, and the people that organize the event. And really thank you and congratulations for your conference. So, la Universidad Autónoma del Estado de México, la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales, el Centro de Investigación en Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades y la Asociación Mexicana de Ciencias Políticas otorgan el presente reconocimiento al Dr. John Elster por impartir la conferencia magistral Psicología e Historia Política, ¿por qué las constituciones suelen fracasar?, en el segundo Congreso Internacional de Ciencia Política, Sociedad Civil y Cultura Democrática, realizado del 11 al 13 de septiembre del 2014, firmado por el Dr. Jorge Olvera García, rector de nuestra universidad, y por el Dr. José Manuel Luque Rojas, presidente de la MESIC. Patria, Ciencia y Trabajo. Felicidades, Dr. John Elster.